We've made it through a full week of tremendous events. I think I've seen some faces here in previous events, so thanks for joining us again. Or if you're a first timer, thanks for coming, and we hope you'll come to several events next week. My name is Ashley Allen, and I'm with the State Department's Climate Change team, and I'll be the Master of Ceremonies here for this event. The event you're joining today is Weathering the Storm, How Businesses Are Addressing Climate Change. So we're showing a perspective here from the private sector. We have with us today, moderating the event and providing the opening remarks, Tim Giuliani, who is the Director of Corporate Engagement at the multi-sectoral C2ES Business Environmental Leadership Council called BELC. With combined revenue of $2 trillion, BELC is the largest U.S.-based group of companies devoted to climate and energy-related policies and solutions. Next to Tim, we have David Hone. David serves as the Chief Climate Change Advisor for Royal Dutch Shell. Make sure that's not me. Oh, it is. Sorry about that. And as a board member and chairman of the International Emissions Trading Association, AIDA. Additionally, David works closely with the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and has been a lead contributor to many of WBCSD's recent energy and climate change publications. Next to David, we have Giles Dixon. And Mr. Dixon serves as Vice President for Environmental Policies and Global Advocacy at Alstom. He leads Alstom's thinking and engagement on energy and environment policy, promoting clean power solutions to climate change and energy security. Mr. Dixon has been Director of International Emissions Trading Association since December 2012 and was previously worked for the UK government. And then finally, we have Jeanette Pablo. She is the Senior Climate Advisor to the CEO of PNM Resources, an electric utility that's based in New Mexico in the United States. She also handles federal affairs, and she is an energy and environmental attorney with 20 years of experience. I'd like to welcome our online audience who's joining us from all over the world. We hope that you will hashtag AskUSCenter on Twitter to join the discussion. Okay, without further ado, let's turn it over to Tim.
Thanks so much, Ashley. My mother always said that the best time to talk about climate resilience was at 6 o'clock on a Friday evening, so I'm glad that you're all here too. Somewhere in the world, maybe somebody is watching where it's 6 in the morning or a more reasonable time of day, but thank you all for coming. The Center for Climate and Energy Solutions is a nonprofit, independent, nonpartisan organization that was founded in 1998 as the Pew Center on Global Climate Change. We depuified in 2011 and became the Center for Climate and Energy Solutions. Our new president, Bob Purchase-Seppi, was Deputy Administrator of US EPA up until August, and he'd been there for the last 5 years. Our key role is engaging with a range of stakeholders to find pragmatic climate and energy solutions and working particularly with the business community. We have corporate strategic partners and very wide list of companies in a number of different sectors. Now, obviously, as the Pew Center and C2ES, we have been very concerned about mitigation, and that remains our primary goal. But over the last couple of years, we've also started a focus on corporate climate resilience. There are a number of reasons for this. First, it's weather and climate impacts are costly, and they're getting increasingly costly and gaining attention, whether that's from the typhoons, floods, while there's not always a clear connection that can be drawn to climate change, we know that climate change increases the risk for these types of events in the future. There's also the realization, particularly in the United States, that not everybody is interested in talking about climate mitigation, and we still have these battles over whether, while that will are willing to talk. So this is a way of helping to start the conversation, kind of a gateway drug to climate change. So last year we published a report called Weathering the Storm, which was basically a desk analysis of how the S&P Global 100 companies are starting to think about extreme weather and climate and adaptation. So we looked at a number of early actions that I'll talk about in a few minutes. Now in 2014 and 2015, we're working with Bank of America and others to take this research a next step. While we did desk research for the first report and some case studies on a number of companies, in this next phase of the research, we're actually going to talk to each of the S&P Global 100, and we're about 40% of the way through that process now. So, how are the companies planning? What are the emerging best practices? And what are barriers for doing more? So some of the results we've seen so far, if you want to frame it as a sort of positive versus challenges, about 9 out of 10 companies questioned recognize weather or climate risks. And companies are disclosing or starting to disclose some climate risk information. At the same time, climate change is often viewed as a risk management problem that can be addressed through existing processes. Well, that part is actually both good news and bad news, because viewing climate risk through the traditional risk management lens tends to focus backwards rather than forwards, and not look at the potential changes in risk that climate change may bring about. There are also what they call fence line issues with regard to infrastructure investment. There are, infrastructure, especially water infrastructure, electricity infrastructure, is often seen as a public good, and when you have transmission between large spaces, it can be very difficult to get funding for that. There are also regulatory and institutional and knowledge barriers. And we see that while there is some disclosure, that the quality of disclosure right now is highly variable. 90% of the global S&P 100 are discussing climate issues. The majority, 82 companies, provided a strong discussion of climate risks. This was up in the last couple of years. And these companies represent a wide range of sectors. But there is this question of the materiality of the risks, particularly when you're talking about climate-specific risks. While 82 companies acknowledge risks in the CDP survey, only 30 of those actually identified those risks in their financial reports or SEC filings. So it's a question of how seriously those risks are being taken. It's one thing to mention them in a CDP report. It's another thing to actually disclose it to the SEC or put it in your financial statement. Types of risk, these are pretty straightforward. Companies have concerns with production capacity and operational costs. Supply chains are often vulnerable. I mentioned the Thailand floods earlier. Everybody knows this example. Shut down, not the hurricanes Katrina and Irene and Sandy. Water is another issue that we're increasingly seeing, with 47 of the companies responding that they have some sort of water stress in their supply chain. So that, from the beverage industry to agriculture to cooling water for power plants. How, next slide. How are companies managing risk? Again, most of them are doing it through their existing risk management processes. As we all know, extreme events have always occurred. Companies are used to them happening. The public is used to them happening. So 77% say they're doing it purely as part of their regular risk management process. But a small and growing number have actually used climate-specific modeling. And we think that is going to be a growing trend, particularly as the 1 in 100-year storm becomes a 1 in 20-year or 1 in 10-year storm. If we're looking at obstacles to action, there's often the uncertain timing and of magnitude of the impacts, especially at a local facility scale. There's a lack of user-friendly tools and decision support. There's often a lack of internal awareness within companies. The lack of management continuity. So you might have a CEO who's very engaged on this issue, and then there's a changeover, and the organizational culture changes. You're looking at risk. So, a lot of the companies that we interviewed, even some of the ones that we did case studies on for the last report, when we first approached them, they'd say, actually, we're not doing anything on climate resilience. And we said, well, actually, can you think about that? Have you done a vulnerability assessment? Are you thinking about extreme weather? Are you thinking about how your crops, or in the case of Weyerhaeuser, their crop is trees, is changing due to a changing climate? And they would say, oh yes, actually we are doing all that. And so it's putting a climate lens on activities that are already happening. And as I said earlier, trying to change that lens to be as much forward-looking as it is back-looking. So the recommendations that we came up with in our last report and are following up on now are creating a clearinghouse for reliable and up-to-date data and analytical tools. The White House is certainly taking a step forward with their climate data initiative, but often, as I said, companies are looking and need very specific data, and that is difficult and costly to come by. We need investment in public infrastructure across the globe, but in the United States as well as the developing world. We need to consider resilience in regulatory policy. Companies, particularly in regulated sectors such as water and electricity and insurance, need their regulators to be forward-looking and open to companies spending money on resilience, and often that's a tough battle. But there's also a huge opportunity for voluntary public-private partnerships, and we think that's an area that we'll obviously see much more in the coming years. So with that framing of the conversation, I'd like to now turn it over to David.
So I should have a few slides coming up. Yeah. Good. Right, well, thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me here to talk. So this is I guess compared to the mitigation discussion, which has been active in Shell since probably 97, 98, this is a relatively new work stream for us. It's been sort of kicking around perhaps for the last 4 years, but over the last 18 months to 2 years has become quite solid, and actually there's real content coming out and a real approach to assessing the risk, and then obviously the next step is deciding what to do and how to actually manage that risk. So from something that was quite a nebulous activity for many, and it wasn't clear how you would take the subject of adaptation and boil it down to something that you could actually do. I think we've made quite a bit of progress, at least in our company, in a relatively short space of time. So, sorry, this is the standard course of this. So let me just start with a picture that we all know. I think is just looking at the time frames out to 2100. And there's really two time frames to consider. The first one, probably through to 2040, maybe 2050, is where we are now and where we're going to be, irrespective of what happens. This is the changes that are pretty much locked in with the CO2 that is already in the atmosphere and the CO2 that is coming over the coming 20 years. And that's an inevitable change that is going to happen, and is not something that we can deviate from, even with stringent mitigation policies. So then the second time frame is in the back half of the century, where quite different outcomes could occur, simply depending on the mitigation activities that we undertake, starting, well, from today, but ideally from the agreement that we hope to see in 12 months' time. And I think at the moment we're focused very much on the first part of this story. So what is it that we're up for over the next 20 and 30 years? Because that, as I said, that is pretty much locked in. And I think, oh yeah, we've got some pictures to show that. Simple picture of the oil and gas industry, and perhaps highlights what some of the potential risks are. So we obviously have in literally every part of the world, certainly on 6 of the 7 continents, from exploration, production. We've got pipelines, refining, and distribution. So all of these activities are potentially exposed one way or the other, and these could be quite local, and not minor, but relatively low cost impacts. And I remember seeing in the sort of the devastation that was wrought last year in the Philippines from the hurricane there. I remember seeing on TV a couple of Shell service stations that have been completely destroyed in this process. But right through to very major changes in areas where we've got large-scale exploration and certainly large-scale production or refining, where the assets that are in place run into multi-billions of dollars in terms of kit on the ground. So these are the types of changes, and they range from changes in, obviously, temperature, changes in sea level, changes in storm surges, and all the things that you would expect as a result of a shifting in climatic patterns. So, the first step really is to understand what some sort of risk assessment might look like, and plotting out the risks that we face. What are the potential changes that might occur, and then by how much does that actually affect us? And so we could plot that out and look at potential changes in the climate, potential changes in our vulnerability as a result of that, and think about some sort of pathway that a particular facility or group of facilities might be up against in terms of changes and the risk that they're facing, and therefore how to mitigate that risk. But the first step, and it's really where we are at today, is about risk assessment and understanding what it is that's changed and what we might be in for. So we really haven't got onto the step yet of large-scale risk management or risk change, simply because the assessment step is quite a large undertaking. And I think this is sort of one facility. And if you think of a company like Shell operating almost everywhere, the facilities go from dozens to hundreds, in some cases to thousands. You think of all the production sites and refineries and distribution terminals and ships and all the things that we have in play at any one time. And it's a very large-scale activity. So there are three steps really, and we're very much in the first one at the moment, which is modelling of climate impacts. And we're working with we have worked with the UK Met Office, and we've started looking at specific sites as a way of just beginning to understand what it is, what changes might actually occur. And we started this about, I think it was about 18 months ago, and we picked a number of sites around the world, I think it was just 4 or 5, in very different locations, and they're listed here, in the North Sea, the Arabian Gulf, and the South China Sea. And we started to look at how the climate might change in those locations, over the first half of this century, as a result of increased CO2 in the atmosphere and changes in temperature. And then we looked at specific parameters there around temperature and sea surface temperature, wave height, precipitation, and so on, and then tried to model the impacts that would have and the changes in risk. And so the outcome of that was some basic understanding as to what might happen and what's going on. And we also did we had an intern last summer who came in and helped us look at sea level changes around in 2 specific locations in the US Gulf and in the Persian Gulf, where we have very big facilities in the sort of the multi-billion dollars of kit, and looking at how sea level might change up to 2050, and then in fact we looked further on out to 2100, and some quite sobering results come out of that as well. So that set of results has led us to a next step of activity, which is to start to think about how we might inventorize the risk on all the facilities around the world. And that's where we're at today. And we're working with a company called Acclimatize to use climate models and to use a risk assessment. We've developing a risk assessment tool that looks at this and can help us inventorize this risk. And so that's the step that we're at. And then obviously that leads to management of risk within the Shell operating facilities. And then the other step, of course, which we haven't yet got into, but we're very cognizant of, is impacts outside the fence line. And this is really the impact of climate change on the community. And I think one of the telling examples of this was during Hurricane Katrina, where it wasn't so much our facilities that were damaged. We just happened to be positioned in the right place that we didn't incur significant damage from the hurricane and the storm surge and all the impacts that New Orleans saw and the areas around it. But the people that worked in them were. And this was very disruptive for us, and it required a real mobilization of Shell effort to help that community get back on its feet. So we actually had people to work in the facilities that we had and get them all going again. And so it's not just about the damage that occurs to something that to the facility that you've got, but you've really also got to think outside the fence line as well. And I should say, that's another step that maybe in a couple of years when we're back here, we might be sort of talking about, but we haven't got to that yet. We're still very much in the modelling and inventorizing of the issue. So the first step that will come out of this, in particular, is updating the design criteria for new projects. So this is something that's having got somewhat feel for what the overall changes and what the impact is and what the risks that we're facing. It's a relatively easy step to update the design criteria for new projects. So that might be about the location of the projects, about the height of the project above sea level. It might be, for instance, about their resilience to temperature. If temperature's too high, heat exchangers, particularly say fin fan heat exchangers that do air heat exchange, can become very inefficient. So you might think about the design criteria for them. There's all sorts of things that you could imagine that you can build in now, you can set the design parameters for, and then that effectively manages that risk going forward at least for another 30 to 40 years, which is the bulk of the lifetime of that project. So that's a process that's starting already. We're doing the screening of existing assets, and I think it's then the consideration of that into what we actually do about that and what our response to that is yet a further step. So I think that's a sort of a story of where Shell is going, what we've done over the last few years, and how this the subject of adaptation is being brought into the design and management of risk in our facilities. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tim, thank you very much for the invitation to be on this panel with you all. C2ES always run very good events at a COP, and we're delighted to be taking part with you again. Ladies and gentlemen, I work for Alstom. You're probably familiar with us. We are a technology and infrastructure company. We make equipment for power generation and transmission and for rail transport. Some of you might have already travelled on the Lima Metro on one of our trains. All of the equipment that we make as a technology company is affected somehow by climate change. So making our equipment more resilient is already factored in to all of our R&D and all of our product development. There are three main challenges here. Number one, the extremes. Tim, David have already mentioned the big well-known ones, Sandy, Irene, Katrina, mentioned Fukushima as well. Second issue is the averages. The higher average water temperatures, the higher average ambient air temperatures. You're probably aware that 2 summers ago in the US, both the Millstone and Long Island Sound nuclear power plants had to close down because the average water temperature had risen above the legally prescribed level at which it is safe to cool nuclear reactors. Okay, it's not an extreme event, it's just the higher average, the sort of red you were seeing on David's slides. The International Energy Agency has said that just a 1 degree Celsius increase in ambient air temperatures will affect the efficiency of thermal turbines in coal plants and nuclear plants in such a way that by the year 2040, those plants will be operating in summer at peak temperatures with 19% less efficiency than they do today, just with 1 degree Celsius. And of course, we're not heading for a 1 degree Celsius world, are we? So you've got the averages, and then the third issue is water. Energy uses a lot of water. The process of energy production globally accounts for 15% of all the freshwater withdrawals in the world every year, and 11% of all the freshwater consumption every year. Let me just be clear here on the distinction between water withdrawals and water consumption. Water withdrawal, you've got a power plant next to a river, you take the water out of the river, you run it through the water cooling tower, and then you discharge a lot of that water back into the river. It may not, of course, be as clean as it was when it went into the power plant. Your withdrawal rate there is high, consumption not necessarily very high. Consumption is when you use the water, say for water cooling, and it evaporates and it's never returned to the original source. Okay? Water withdrawal rates are very high in coal-fired power plants and in nuclear power plants. Water consumption rates are very low in nuclear power plants, They're relatively high in coal-fired power plants, but do you know which form of energy globally has the highest water consumption rate? It's biofuels. And that, of course, is because of the water used in irrigating the large number of crops that have to be grown to produce biofuels. I just make that statement a fact. I make no comment on it. Okay, so those are the issues that we are facing as a technology company. So what the hell are we doing about it? Okay, so people always ask, what's your latest gizmo? How are you solving the world's problems? Alstom, let me give you some key facts. Renewables, first of all. The equipment is being made more resilient. Wind turbines rely very heavily on the lubricants. It's the lubricants that keep those blades going round. We're designing new lubricants that will not freeze in very cold temperatures and will not melt in very high temperatures. It sounds very simple, but it's crucial to the operation of wind turbines. Turbine braking on wind turbines as well. If the wind is too much, because there are more storms than there used to be, you need to be confident that your turbines are going to stop and that they're going to stop safely. So we're working on the turbine braking technology. Let's now look at the transmission network, okay? I mean, we all know what happens when there are extreme weather events. Transmission lines get knocked down, the system collapses. What we're doing is using IT, okay? We're putting sensors into the transmission network that are giving us greater understanding about what's happening to the weather, what may be happening to the weather. They're also giving us more information about how the grid might respond. And this is using power electronics technology. It's giving us more data flows about the performance of the transmission network, and it's allowing us, crucially, to do predictive maintenance. If you don't remember very much about what I'm saying today, just remember predictive maintenance. It sounds very boring, but it will keep our energy systems going. And then finally, of course, we're producing technology that will reduce the water footprint of thermal power plants. In South Africa, we are building 2 huge power plants with Eskom, Medupi and Kusile. You may be familiar with them. They're each 4.5 gigawatts. These are coal-fired power plants, but they're not going to use water cooling. It's going to be dry cooling systems. That's very good for the water footprint. Actually, there's an energy penalty to having dry cooling because it uses more electricity in the power plant. And if the power plant's running off coal, maybe there's a CO2 impact there, but that has to be managed. We're also making more use of seawater cooling as opposed to freshwater cooling. And then we're introducing technology in thermal plants that will recycle the water more efficiently. So the water withdrawal rates will go down. Now, when you recycle water more inside a power plant, it might have the effect that the water consumption rate actually goes up, because by the time you've recycled it 4 or 5 times, it's not safe to put it back into a river. But that's the trade-off that we're grappling with. And of course, we're working to ensure that when we do discharge water from a power plant back into a natural source, that it is as clean as possible. So that's the technology. Finally, what do I think governments should be doing about this? I'm going to focus on water, but I'll say a few words about wider resilience. David, you mentioned location. It seems fairly obvious to us that government should be encouraging infrastructure operators to locate their infrastructure increasingly in climate-resilient locations. This is not rocket science. It's quite obvious that some geographical locations are more exposed than others, so try and put your power plants in particular in the less exposed areas and use government policy to push investments in that direction. Some people say on the issue of water, what about pricing it? Okay, let's put a price on water. We don't think that would necessarily work, because water is not like CO2. How available it is varies greatly from one area to another. Okay, so your approach to water consumption has to be much more regional than your approach to CO2, which clearly is a much more global commodity. Also, we do know that the impact of water pricing would probably be very small on decisions that utilities make about where they locate power plants. But what is clear is that the availability of water is already a big factor in determining decisions about where power plants are located. So it's about availability rather than about the price of water. So those, I think, are the only points I'd want to make at this stage. Look forward to hearing what you have to say when we get to discussion. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm not going to be as energetic as you, and I'm certainly not going to be as big as you or as academic as Tim. But so my name is Jeanette Pablo, and I work for PNM Resources. PNM Resources is an electric utility headquartered in New Mexico, as she said. And why that's relevant is probably we're the smallest company probably here in Lima from the U.S. And we deal with some factors that impact our business resiliency, our business model, and our climate approach very much. So, for example, New Mexico is actually the poorest state in the country today. It's not Mississippi anymore, and that's what everybody says. Not Mississippi? No, it's New Mexico, and yet we have two DOE national labs in the attendant PhD communities. We have some of the most wealthy counties in New Mexico, and yet the Navajo Nation has a 40% unemployment. The state has 26+% unemployment, and 1 in 3 children go hungry. So when you're talking about business resiliency and climate risk, we also actually have a very temperate climate. We're not Louisiana, and I think some Louisiana legislatures might be interested in your comments on locating power plants in someplace else. But because they're very concerned, about climate resiliency with the storms, but they need their jobs. So, but we have a very temperate climate, and in fact, we had a little bit of a growth in our demand when people switched from swamp coolers to air conditioning. But most of our load is 40% of our load is lighting. So actually, our demand is down because of a very successful energy efficiency program. But nonetheless, we were very fortunate to have a CEO who was a big leader about 10 years ago and recognized quite clearly that climate was a huge risk for the state and the business. And he led us down a path that, frankly, we're reaping the rewards now. So he came out in favor of mandatory climate change. He initiated a work with the state and stakeholders in 2006 to begin incorporating climate pricing into all of our generation and infrastructure modeling. Then we got a new CEO who followed in those footsteps, and her name is Pat Kalan. She's with us today, and she actually took us even further down the path where this climate modeling actually has in a sense, it has positioned us, a very small company with and 50% of the workforce actually fails the drug test because of crystal meth. So these are some of the challenges that we deal with. We need our affluent consumers to be able to afford it, to be able to get what they want, which is typically renewable generation, and we need our consumers who are low income to be able to afford those things as well, right? So two examples I have about our sort of climate resiliency is that the first one is about 4 years ago we have one big power plant, one of the biggest in the country, up in the Four Corners area. The EPA came out with some expected rules on NOx reduction. We were facing a $1 billion investment for SCRs on the power plant, and we were looking at a number of things, including our climate modeling, and realizing that the only thing these $1 billion would get us would be NOx reductions, which, looking ahead, was a very, very narrow way of thinking. And I think what the speakers who preceded me or sort of described is, if you want to be business resilient and climate resilience, you cannot be thinking along a single track. So we threw in a $10 climate price. It tipped us over the edge, and actually we are shutting down half of that plant. We're saving 50% on water. We're saving 50% on CO2. We are extremely well positioned for the Clean Power Plan, and we are actually able to change or adapt our business model to actually what our consumers are really looking for now and in the long term at a much lower cost than would have otherwise been available. The second example I'd like to mention it's actually not a climate example, but it is sort of a Western model for how to deal with these kinds of events. And so in 1992, the Endangered Species Act, we had 2 fish in the Colorado River area that were listed, razorback sucker and the Colorado pike minnow. And we entered into a cooperative agreement with the state of New Mexico, the state of Utah, the state of Colorado, 2 Indian tribes, the Southern Utes, the Jicarilla Apaches, and the Ute Mountain tribes, and as well as a number of the Department of Interior, other stakeholders. And through this, what is essentially a water sharing agreement, we have had 0 litigation. The 2 fish are in the foreseeable future destined to be delisted. And again, with, as you mentioned, water being such a critical natural resource that is going to be, has already been affected in the West and elsewhere, this water sharing agreement has enabled actually sort of small D development, in other words, economic development that doesn't harm the environment, to flourish, even as these incredibly different stakeholders have been able to agree on how to share the water and restore these fish. And I think this will be a model that we will be using in the future. So with that, I'd just like to offer to answer any questions with the rest of my panelists.
Great. Thank you so much to our panelists. It's very interesting to see different spots in different areas of energy production and distribution. So it's very useful for us, I think, to think about energy not only as either the problem or the solution, as we usually think about it in this world related to mitigation, but also in relation to adaptation. So it's good to sort of get our heads around that role of the energy sector as well. Let's turn to question and answer. I know that Tim is going to moderate some questions up here, and we want to also take yours from the audience as well as from the web, #AskUSCenter. Tim, do you want to kick us off?
Sure. I touched briefly on the Security and Exchange Commission, SEC, guidance on climate risk disclosure. There is guidance that companies should disclose if the risks are material. And there seems to be perhaps what's the word, unrealistic expectation by some about the types of responses that should be forthcoming, and that they're not enough. And I wondered if any of you would be interested in commenting on that.
And so for an international audience, that if you could just explain that first part about the security.
The Security and Exchange Commission being the regulatory agency that oversees financial reporting of corporations.
And while you all are thinking about that one, mulling that one over, let me take one question from the audience. Who has a question here in the audience? Okay.
My question is for David. David, one of the things that I find quite strange, and I want to know if it's ever come up in any of your research, is that we know that there was once upon a time no oxygen, there was just carbon dioxide 3.9 billion years ago, and that therefore the oxygen that is in circulation today is probably the other half of the carbon that's sitting down in coal, oil, and limestone. So we also know that when you burn the coal, oil, and limestone, that you can that it takes back its matching oxygen above. So my question to you is, and we know that when the oxygen levels of the Earth are falling, and they're nearly at 20% now, and they're going to go to 19% will be gasping for air, and 18% will be gone. So how can you talk about peak oil and peak coal? Because to my mind, there's not going to be anybody there of oxygen-breathing people to actually make use of it if it takes back its own oxygen.
We're diving right into the sticky questions outside of the resilience realm. Okay, let's take those two.
Well, gosh, they were almost exactly the same. So why don't we start with David and then we'll...
Yeah, well, I'm a bit. I don't really know where to start on that. So no one's ever presented a hypothesis like that to me before, that burning, the consumption of fossil fuels would lead to oxygen deprivation on the planet. I'm not aware that that's a serious view of, for instance, the IPCC at all.
Why don't we just go ahead and move on to the second question, and then we can take our conversation offline.
So on the exciting topic of the Securities and Exchange Commission climate disclosure, less scientific, is whether many of you know that companies are required to disclose material facts about company activity in their 10K disclosures to the SEC, and I'm actually part of the team that reviews those disclosures on a quarterly basis and updates them. And so I think there was maybe a lot of expectation that these disclosures would be a valuable tool in terms of sort of elevating the profile of climate in companies where it's not already elevated, and that has been a little bit of a disappointment because companies where climate is sort of in the DNA, or climate considerations in the DNA, are already disclosing those facts or the risks to the company. And companies that are not, apparently have not, I just was sort of looking it up this afternoon, haven't really changed their ways in terms of including climate disclosure, risk disclosure. However, what I would say is that we do take it very seriously. We do update it on a quarterly basis, and we strive to keep our information as up to date and accurate as possible, but it is a little bit too generic a disclosure to be truly valuable. So for example, we say what is the expectation of climate legislation in Congress? 0. What is going to come out of the EPA? 100% chance of something happening. How is it going to impact us? Well, we're already modeling for it. And we have this agreement with EPA in the state of New Mexico to shut down the coal plant and replace it with nuclear, renewables, and peaking gas. And so it doesn't really drive things. What it might do is it might actually sort of permeate the mid-level manager consciousness, because those are the people who are working on it. Right, you've got your CEO, you've got your public policy people up, on the C-suite level that are doing it, and this is sort of more mid-level manager part. But really, to be, I think, valuable in the way that people were envisioning it would be, you'd have to be a little more specific. Like, how does the clean power plan going to impact you, and what are you doing about it? That might be not a realistic thing for the SEC to require, but that's where you probably would get the results that the expectations would. People hoped for.
At Alstom, we take the disclosure of climate risk extremely seriously. We do it every year with the Carbon Disclosure Project and with the Dow Jones Sustainability Index, and we've just had our scores for last year, and they were good. But we are a provider of technology and equipment. We are not a project developer. We do not own generation or transmission assets, nor do we own fossil fuel assets. So we're in a slightly different part of the chain. But where this is hitting us, hitting is, sorry, the wrong word to use, affecting, a neutral word, is we are constantly putting forward bids to people who are in the procurement game, whether it's public authorities doing public procurement for rail transport, or public utilities or private utilities procuring new power plants. And what we are seeing now in procurement is that there's an ever higher score being attached to what we say about the climate resilience of the equipment and technology that we are offering in that tender. So we are being driven by the market, and when it's a public procurement body, by the public rules, to ensure that what we're offering is increasingly resilient.
Okay, we have time for just one more round of questions. I've got one there. Any others here? So I'll take these two here, and then, Tim, if you want to end us with one there. Okay.
Thank you. I'm Suleiman. I'm from Nigeria. unexpectedly, my first question will be for David. I would like to first thank you for your presentation. What I'd like to know, and it's interesting to know that Shell is beginning to research into adaptation. We know there's been a lot of work in terms of mitigation, and some of us believe, okay, that is also driven by the business potential there. What I would like to know from you is what is driving the research into adaptation by the company? Is it within the context of health stewardship, or is it, like you said, thinking outside of the fence, the example you give in the States where your workforce perhaps is affected? What is driving this? Because this tells us for how long this is going to last or how far it's going to go. My second question to ask Tom is that, and it's interesting to say that companies should start to think about areas that are less vulnerable in terms of situating facilities. I just want to ask how this fits into the pricing of products, for instance. Will they make things available and accessible to the people at the lower rungs of the ladder? Thank you.
Thank you. Very good questions there, and we'll go one more back here.
Thank you very much. Very interesting presentation. I am Takashi Hongo, Mitsui, and before joining Mitsui, I worked for public finance institution for many years. And in my experience, when we review the risk of the project, for instance, hydro dam project, we will check the past data. For instance, what is the precipitation of past 30 years or 50 years. From this analysis, we will review we will focus the risk of the collapse of the dam or the overflow or many things. So the climate change and extreme weather, in principle, I think my feeling is similar but different. That means probability of the risk of the probability of extreme weather and the magnitude of the extreme weather is going to be increased. So my question is C2ES. So the many companies are aware the climate change risk, but what is their assumption or what is your assumption about the future risk? For instance, the IPCC report said the risk would be near-term risk is not so high, but long-term risk is soared. So that means a company like a manufacturing investment and the infrastructure investment completely different. So my question is very interesting survey, but I would like to know more about the assumption of the extreme weather and the climate change. Thank you.
Great. So not just how are companies looking at current risk, but even further out in the future, how are companies taking account for even greater risk in the future?
Sure. Well, I'll start with that. Thank you for the question. As I mentioned in the presentation, this is part of the sea change that we need to see happen in order, I think, for climate risk to truly be incorporated into corporate planning. That too often the risk is looked at in the rearview mirror and not on what will happen over the next 20, 50, 100 years. Of course, there are not that many facilities that will be around in 100 years. There are more that will be around in 50 years, and they're often in the utility industry because power plants have a 50, 60-year life cycle. So that, as Giles was saying, when you're thinking about where you're going to putting that power plant, you should be thinking about what future climate assumptions are going to be. But we don't know what those assumptions should be. We know the ranges, but those ranges vary based on, obviously, what sort of mitigation we do. So there's no clear answer, unfortunately, to your question. And every company will come at it a little bit differently, but that's one of the major information challenges that we have at the moment.
So before I get to your question, just to follow on here, actually, certainly in the processing side, so in the refining industry and the chemical industry, it may not be the actual distilling columns and reactors that are there in 50 or in 100 years, but the site will probably still be there. So the site where I started work in Shell is, I think we bought in the 1930s, built the refinery in the 1940s because there was a delay due to the Second World War. And here we are in 2014, and it's now been sold to another company who will probably run it for another 20 years. And even if the refinery changed shape in that time, it would probably become a distribution terminal or something like that, which could last for another 50 years. So I think actually the site has a very, very long lifetime in the oil and gas industry, even if the equipment on it changes over time. So to answer the question over here, the reason we started looking at this was the simple fact that change was starting to appear. We could see changes in some sites that were presenting conditions that didn't exist 20 and 30 years ago. And then there was the observation that, for instance, sea level is clearly rising, and it's rising. It may be rising on a steepening curve. So you just can't ignore that. I think the work that we were doing on climate was mainly dictated by mitigation, but as far back as when 2000, people were starting to say, well, what about adaptation? And the response was sort of, well, yeah, we'll get to that. But I think it reached the point probably in about 2010, 2011, where it was clear this was an issue that change was underway, and we had to reassess the risks that were associated with it. So it was simple, prudent business practice to actually look at this.
I'd like to reply to your question, Suleiman, about who pays for all of this, particularly local communities. How do they carry the cost? Look, building resilience into the energy system is about risk management at the end of the day. Superstorm Sandy cost New York City over $50 billion, and that cost ultimately is borne by ratepayers in New York City. So, yeah, making the energy system more resilient may well carry a cost in the short term, but look at the cost of the longer-term cost of the penalties of not making that investment. There's something I would say, because you're from Nigeria and you're doing a lot of excellent work on distributed generation, especially through solar. And this is a key element of strengthening the resilience of the power system, microgeneration and microgrids. Okay? And this is not just something for developing countries, it's something for developed countries as well. In the US, we are doing microgrid pilot projects where you actually take an urban area, maybe with schools or hospitals, and they have their own power generation capability, which will often be renewable, and you build a distribution grid around that, which is detached from the main transmission and distribution networks, which makes them more resilient in the event of climate events taking place. And of course, what you're doing with distributed generation in Nigeria provides a model for that sort of thing as well.
Okay, thank you so much for your very good questions, and thank you to our panelists. Let's give them one more round of applause. Thank you for joining us at the U.S. Center. We close for the weekend, but we open back up on Monday with events by NASA, NOAA on predicting regional climate extremes, so very much what you're dealing with right here exactly. Coastal Climate Services, so blue carbon, we'll talk about that Monday afternoon. And then finally, we'll bring the private sector back in Monday evening at 6 p.m. on finding innovative financing options for clean energy. Okay, thank you very much. See you next week.
Thank you.